was out so long that I came back from a trip and into dispatch, and they said, "Oh, hey, we got a hot trip. You got to go to Youngstown, Ohio." And I'm going, I can't hold my eyes open. I've been out like 18 hours. I'm done. And he goes, "No, don't worry about it. We got you a co-pilot. All you got to do is take off. You can sleep en route, and then you can land." You know, so I said, "Well, okay, I'll do it." After the Army, I went back to school at Northwestern Michigan College and was in a flight program there, getting my ratings and whatnot. And after I got my multi-engine rating, I hung out with a couple of the male freight pilots from a company out of Detroit, and I started riding with them at night. So that was my first experience in Twin Beach hauling night freight, in this case U.S. mail. And so that's how I got started and where my interest really came from. And then later on, after graduating from school, I worked for a fixed base operation out of Lansing, Michigan. And we had a couple of freight airplanes there. And so I flew freight in those a bit. And one night I flew a trip to Pontiac, Michigan, and there was a large Beech 18 freight operator there. And he offered me a job, and the pilot I was flying with, he asked him if, you know, can the kid fly or not, because I was a kid then. And he said, "Well, yeah, when everything's going okay, he's pretty good." So, yeah, so I went to work for this gentleman. The company at the time, I don't know if we should use the name or not, but it was Wyman Pilot Service, was what it was called. And so he had about 8 Beech 18s, and he had a Cherokee 6, and he had a Cessna 310. And I was hired to fly the Beech 18 and, well, whatever else he needed, if he needed it at that time. So I was supposed to get training, and that training amounted to one flight with one of the other pilots on a trip, and then they sent me down to the FAA in Detroit to get a check ride. So that was pretty exciting. I might have had a whopping 20 hours in a Twin Beech, you know, so it was a lot of fun. I think the FAA examiner was more nervous than I was. He was, yeah, I think other Beech 18 pilots had scared him, so he
knew what he was getting into.
Yeah, he sat on the edge of his seat the whole time, and it was pretty interesting. But anyway, later on, you know, I started flying trips, and the trips we got paid a whopping 12 cents a mile. And so the deal was, if you wanted to make some real money, you would hustle your own freight. Like I might fly a trip from Pontiac to Dallas, for instance, and then while I was sitting in the freight forwarding place in Dallas, if I could hustle another trip somewhere else, like to Memphis, then I got 24 cents a mile. So if I could get to Memphis and hustle something else to somewhere else, maybe somewhere in New Jersey, we used to go to Teterboro quite a bit, and so
part salesman, part pilot.
Part pilot.
But definitely part salesman.
Definitely part salesman if you want to make any real money. And so then I get 36 cents a mile. So I'll never forget, this is mid-70s, so I ended up 1 week, I actually got a $1,000 paycheck. And the boss, we got paid weekly. And he would run around the office and wave your check in the air to all the other pilots and say, "See what he did, see what he did?" Now what he didn't tell them was, I went to work Monday night and I didn't see a bed till Saturday, you know. So most of the time we slept in the back of the airplane, coveralls and whatever else you could find to stay warm. Or sometimes in the fixed base operations, which I've been throwing out of some nice ones because I smelled too greasy and oily or whatever. So
you smelled like a freight dog.
Smelled like a freight dog, yeah, yeah.
So you just flew around with your bed in the cargo hold of the plane?
Yeah, usually a sleeping bag or something like that. Yeah. Yeah, I'll never forget one year I got audited. Well, that year I got audited by the IRS because I put down meals, you know, that I'd bought, but I had no receipts for meals. And they were quite concerned about that. And I said, well, it's all out of vending machines at 2 o'clock in the morning, you know, so it's not like I ate at a restaurant anywhere, you know, so. So good stuff. But so it was the outfit was interesting to say the least. Later on, I got a lot of job interviews because people realized I'd survived flying night freight for single pilot, and so they thought, well, you know, you must have something on the ball. You survived that period of time in your life. And most of the flying I did was a lot up in Canada in the Northern Tier. Winter flying, a lot of winter and snow flying, that sort of stuff. So.
But what prepared you for that? Because that's a kind of a different kettle of fish, isn't it?
Well, you just kind of get thrown into it and you make it work. And fortunately for me, I had a great mentor, and I think that's why I survived all that. I could call my mentor, and he's gone now, Al Hyatt, but I could call Al and say, hey, they want me to do this, and how do I handle that? And and he would tell me. But the best advice he ever gave me was to fly the freight as if I were flying passengers. He said, that'll keep you alive, and there's no freight worth dying for. None. And you had to be careful of freight forwarders. I was in Detroit one time and I was supposed to fly 1,000 carburetor spacers that were supposedly 2 pounds each. The Twin Beach, as nice as it is, carry about 2,000 pounds. So I picked up this carburetor spacer one day and I thought, ooh, it feels heavier than 2 pounds. So I scrounged around and I found a scale somewhere and they were 4 pounds. So they're going to put 4,000, double the load capability of the airplane on my airplane. And so again, this is a salesman thing. You don't have to call it the freight forwarder and say, hey, I'm not carrying all this. We're going to split the load. We're going to carry 2 loads and do it that way. So they'd holler and yell and, but you'd say, well, I'm not flying it, so you do what you want to do. So, but that happened to a friend of mine. In fact, a guy that trained me for that job, he had that happen. He didn't check the weight, and he took off out of, I think it was Flint, Michigan, and lost an engine shortly after takeoff. And he ended up flying down the highway, basically just above the road signs, and got on down to, I forget what airport he finally landed at, nearby, a little airport. And he found out he had an extra, 1,000 pounds or so over his max gross weight. So he was really lucky to be alive. But
very lucky.
But the big thing with this job was you had to know when to say no. And some of the guys didn't say no, and they're not with us anymore. So, and I have those lucky moments. There were some of those moments where I came back after being out for way longer than I should have been. Which, by the way, hopefully there's a statute of limitations on some of this. So,
I think that's kind of the general consensus with all the guys that I talk to.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was out so long that I came back from a trip and into dispatch, and I said, oh, hey, we got a hot trip. You got to go to Youngstown, Ohio. And I'm going, I can't hold my eyes open. I've been out like 18 hours. I'm done. And he goes, no, don't worry about it. We got you a co-pilot. All you got to do is take off. You can sleep en route, and then you can land. So I said, well, okay, I'll do it. So I get to the airplane. I meet the co-pilot, and he's been out longer than me. And before I even get the wheels up, he's sleeping in the right seat. And I get down to Youngstown, Ohio, and the last thing I remember there was I reported the final approach fix inbound, and had started my descent, and I woke up over the runway for some reason. I had an angel on my shoulder, and just happened to be over the runway in time to flare and land. So,
wow.
So that's when I quit flying that tired. So, yeah. Well, the craziest thing I think was I had a trip to Montreal, Canada, and I was flying a Beech 18 that had a gas-fired heater, and it's middle of winter. It's like January or February, and I get up near Montreal, and there's a lot of traffic going on. It's a blizzard. It's snowing. And so they put me into a hold, and just as I get into the hold, my gas-fired heater goes out. So I have no heat, and these airplanes don't have any insulation to save weight. So I'm in this hold, and no heat, and it's about, I don't know, 5 or 10 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, it's really cold, and I'm getting really, really, really cold. And so I hung in there, and I should have probably declared an emergency because I wasn't realizing how cold I was getting. But I finally work my way down and get on the approach, and I land the airplane and have to taxi up to the customs circle. It's so cold and blowing out. The customs agent, he's rubbing the frost off the window, and he's trying to wave me to come in, which normally they would come out and inspect you and then you would come in. But I was so cold I couldn't get out of my seat. I was frozen in the seat. They had to come out and get me out of the seat. So I got inside and started to thaw out, and they sent me down to the Canadian fixed base operation. And so I walked in there, and I walked to the back of where the pilot lounge was. And it was the first night I saw Fantasy Island with all the palm trees and all that. But so I thawed out there, and then went on my way. But that was probably one of the craziest times because it was so cold. And another lesson learned, don't ever fly that cold. The really unusual thing is you get to the different places for forwarding freight. And what was really sad in a lot of ways, of course, was that for us, it was almost like, in that period, it was almost like, you know, fighter pilots, in that you'd get to a freight forwarding outfit and you'd say, hey, have you seen George so-and-so lately? And you say, oh no, he went down in Lake Erie last week. You know, things like that. So we probably lost at least one beach a week anyway, on average, throughout that freight hauling period. Yeah.
Which was how long about?
Well, for me, it was only about a year.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
yeah.
Oh gosh, that's so
yeah.
much.
Yeah, we had a fatality. I was training a friend of mine to be a relief pilot for me, so I could take an airplane near where I lived. And he rode with our chief pilot one night when I had said, don't ride with anybody else, and you know, and they had been out for an extreme amount of time, and they ended up crashing in Pontiac Lake in Michigan, both asleep apparently. And so the FAA came in and they did a big inspection and investigation, and the FAA inspector is looking at my logbook and he's flipping through it, and he goes, why are you working here? And I said, well, sir, I'm not anymore. He closed up my logbook and said, have a nice day. And that's when I left there and went on, you know, moved on from there. But,
right.
But there were a lot of fun nights. There were some beautiful nights flying across Canada, and I really like that. It's beautiful to fly at night. There were times I saw the northern lights like nobody else could ever see them, you know, up there. Just amazing. But you're also independent and you're your own boss, so to speak. As long as you get the freight where it needs to go and get the airplane back, nobody cares what you do in between. And so you're the boss, you're in charge of your own life, and you make those decisions. And I think that was really a good part of it that I really enjoyed, was, you know, felt like I could fly anywhere in the world, you know, and be okay. So
there's that freedom. That
freedom,
really is
absolutely.
Huge.
Yeah, it's huge.
A huge motivator.
It really is. I don't know that there is a balance, but you know, you're trying to build some time and build your career and that sort of thing. But the one thing that I always did is when I was done flying, my family got my 100% attention. So, you know, and that's just the way it's always been. Because I went on from there to fly corporate and airline and so on, and other things. And so I always, when I was off, my family got my 100%. In our case with these beaches, the only alcohol we had was for the props. And I'm glad you brought it up, because we had inflatable boots, you know, on the leading edges of the wings and the horizontal stabilizer. And we called them last chance boots. And the reason we did is because they were so poorly maintained, we didn't know if you'd get more than one shot at it. So we would fly along and collect as much ice as we dared before we turned the boots on. And sometimes, like what happened to a friend of mine, he actuated his boots, and on the left wing at night going into Atlanta, he couldn't see it, but the boot had ripped all along the length of the wing at the bottom and folded up over the top of the wing. And he got rid of his ice, but what he didn't know is that rubber was laying on top of the wing, but at 160 miles an hour or whatever, it was okay. You know, but as he slowed down for the approach into Atlanta, that rubber would come up like a giant spoiler and the wing would stall. So, you know, he was a pretty smart guy, so he figured out I got to go fast. So, you know, he landed at Twin Beach at probably 180 miles an hour to keep that from happening, and then found out the boots had ripped halfway off. And so that's why we call them last chance boots, because you just never knew what you're going to get. And we had another little rule, which is probably true in all the old freight airplanes, whether it was a Beech 18 or a DC-3 or whatever. You never touched a switch that wasn't shiny. So because the ones that weren't shiny, you had no idea what it was going to do. You know, if it was shiny, somebody else had used it and it was okay. So if you,
primitive.
it works. Yeah, and the other thing is, if you moved a switch and you didn't like what happened, you undid it. You know, come back. It's like if I put the flaps down and the airplane started to roll, I put the flaps back up. You know, it's like, so absolutely, it's very much hands-on feel kind of flying in a lot of ways. And you learn some other things too. I mean, I probably shouldn't tell a story, but one of the things that we do is, I flew out of Pontiac, Michigan, and in that particular winter, the ILS was down the instrument landing system. So we couldn't get down as low as we'd like, and so often we'd miss the approach there and have to go to Detroit City Airport or Detroit Metro Airport to get in. I always elected to go to Detroit City because there was a restaurant bar there called Sonny's. And on a Friday night, if I couldn't get into Pontiac and I got to Detroit City, I'd park the airplane and I'd run up to Sonny's as fast as I could and get a beer. Because the boss was inevitably going to call and say, hey, I need you to go to Cleveland. And you go, ah, sorry, can't, had a beer. So.
Good strategies.
Yeah. Yeah, you had to use the, use the rules to your advantage, that kind of thing. But overall, it was a fascinating way to go. I wouldn't say that we didn't have any equipment. I didn't have radar in the airplane. To fly freight into Canada, you had to have autopilot, supposedly a functioning autopilot, if you were flying single pilot. So what would happen is we had 8 Beech 18s. One of them had a functioning autopilot. The rest of them just had autopilot heads with no guts. So you'd fly into Canada and the inspector would come out and look at your airplane and see the autopilot heads. Oh, good, you got an autopilot. It's all good. So we never had an autopilot. You always hand flew the whole time. So you'd pull the mixture and look out the window until you got a nice pretty blue flame coming out, and you're just about right. So yeah. So one of the, like you talked about being bored, one night I was flying, I had to fly the 310, the Cessna 310, and I was up over Toronto, and really nothing going on. I'm talking to the controller, just shooting a breeze, but I had the fuel selectors on the aux tanks, which are relatively small tanks, and I had figured out with this airplane, if I wait until I saw the fuel pressure needle wiggle a little bit, I could quick switch back to the main and no problem, right? But I got talking to this controller, and we're talking about family or whatever. And I also had a little trouble with the left engine that night, just running a little rough. And I had in the back of my mind, if I have a problem, the left engine's going to be a problem. So we're talking, and I kind of kept my hand just hanging by the fuel lever. And as we're talking, all of a sudden, the left engine just quits. Well, like I said, I already had it in my mind that if I was going to have a problem, it's going to be the left engine. So I started to go through the procedure and feather the left engine, and the right engine quit. So I'm over at Toronto, I think it was like 7,000 feet or something, with both engines out. And I'm like, uh-oh. Then I remembered right away, fuel, switch both tanks back, and I only lost a couple thousand feet before I finally, and the controller goes, everything okay? Yeah, it's fine, great, I'm good. So, yeah. So that was kind of a fun night. I came to work one night, and as I pulled up and parked my car and started walking across the ramp, I saw 2, like me now, older fellows, walking toward an airplane.
Experienced. Yeah,
experienced, yes. But one was walking with a limp and a cane, and the other had an eye patch on. And I'd never seen these guys before. I said, what are you guys doing? Well, Maury, he got short pilots, and we're going to go fly his trip for him. I said, really? And they said, yeah, it takes 2 of us to make one good pilot. So, and of course, they had no authorization, but they didn't care either. So they just flew the trip together. So, yeah.
Oh, that's crazy.
Yeah.
He's got the eyes. I've got the limbs.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that Maury wanted you to do is if he could talk you into it, he'd like you to go out, buy a nice new car, get a nice new house, get hungry, so you'll fly harder.
Stay indebted.
Stay indebted.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. That was his way of keeping people going. When I started training other guys in it, one of my favorite tricks was to teach them all about the systems and everything, and go through the pre-flight and stuff, and get them to start the engines, and then on a nice wide open ramp, say, okay, let's taxi out to the runway, and just not say anything, And but I would leave you've got a locking tail wheel. I would have them leave the tail wheel unlocked. So, invariably they couldn't go more than, 15, 20 seconds without going whoop, whoop, like what's going on. So, school of hard knocks, that kind of thing. The things, though, I learned in a Twin Beech that kept me alive, particularly landing in adverse conditions, strong crosswinds, that kind of stuff, I used flying jets. It worked just as well in a jet as it worked in a Twin Beech. So, in fact, I had one time I landed in lodges out in the Azores with a severe crosswind in a 757, and I was a co-pilot, but it was my leg, so I landed the airplane and with a technique that I would have used in a Twin Beech, and the captain looked at me and said, "Where did you learn to do that?" I said, "Survival school, Beech 18s in the winter." Yeah. So yeah, so the things we learned in these airplanes, they carried over to almost everything else that you fly. So
Yeah, several guys made the comment that 757 or 747, they're easier planes to fly than a Beech-18.
Yeah, yeah, they really are.
You don't think that, you know,
No.
It's a non-pilot, but...
The thing is, like, one of the guys that came to work for us was a friend of the owner who had been a B-52 pilot in the Air Force and was a retired colonel, actually. But anyway, his buddy got out of the Air Force and he offered him a job. Well, come fly for me. Well, he was an F-4 pilot, right? So Vietnam vet, all that and everything, but he put him in a Twin Beach, you know. And it's like, I'm trying to train this guy and he's rolling down the runway and he rotates and he like points it up about 25 degrees up in the sky and I'm going, no, we're gonna die, you know. So he was so used to having all that power. He said, well, we got two 450 horsepower engines. I said, don't believe it. It's just, you know, it's not the same thing. You're not gonna go anywhere. So, but fun stuff.
What was the most unusual cargo you flew, or?
I would say it was a one odd-shaped, left-threaded nut that I flew to Oshawa, Ontario, for the production line that had gone down.
That's all they needed?
One nut in an envelope, and I had to hand carry it to get it to the guy to make sure it got where it was supposed to go.
That's great.
Yeah. So one nut.
That's a good one. That's a good one.
Yeah. Now the other thing is Canada and U.S. Customs and all that, dealing with customs was a problem all the time. Well, I wouldn't say a real problem, but it was an issue. And I was flying into Oshawa, Ontario quite a bit, and one of the deals there was once you landed, you couldn't get out of your airplane until Canadian Customs or Immigration came and cleared you to get out of the airplane. Well, it's bitter cold winter, and a couple of times, you know, the people I was flying freight for, like GM or whatever, didn't make the arrangements or forgot or something, so you're sitting in the airplane, you're freezing to death. And so eventually I talked to this one customs agent and I said, hey, if we get caught like this again, you know, we're in here, we're freezing, you know, I said, would it be okay if we get out of the airplane and just go straight into the flying club and just into the hallway and sit on the wooden bench and wait for you to get here? And this guy's name was Joe, and he said, you know, that would be all right with me. I'd be okay with that under these conditions. I said, okay. So like a week later, I'm flying with a buddy of mine, I'm breaking in, and we get there and customs doesn't come, and I call the tower and I say, hey, you know, we're gonna go ahead and go into the flying club and sit down and wait for the customs guy. He says, you know that you're not supposed to do that, you're not supposed to leave the airplane. I said, I know. I said, but we have permission from Joe. Who's on duty tonight with customs? He goes, well, see, Joe. I said, okay, great, we'll just go in and it'll be okay. So we go in and we sit down on the bench, and you know, 20, 30 minutes later, Joe shows up, but it's a different Joe. He wants to send us to jail and impound our airplanes. Which he didn't, but he made it quite clear that we were outside his rules. So, and then my break-in pilot, you know, he was trying to argue with him, and I'm kicking him, you know, like, no, shut up, you know, let's be nice here. Yeah, so we want to go home. Yeah. Yeah, there's two things I have to do with fire. One is I stopped in Tennessee, I forget where now, and middle of the night, but they had somebody working at the fixed base operation, and so I walked in, I said, hey, top off my beach, will you? And I'd parked near the fuel pumps, and he said, sure. So I go in and use the restroom, you know, get something out of the snack bar, go back out to the airplane, and this was an old converted C-45, and it had, in the old days, a nose tank, fuel tank. The cap was still there, but there was no tank, and here was this line guy pumping fuel into my Twin Beach in the nose, and I'm watching it run out the tail. So it was kind of a long night that night, because I didn't dare turn anything on for the longest time.
Well, yeah. I was going to say, so he filled your airplane with gas, and so what happened? I mean...
Well, I had to let it all just drained out eventually.
But you could get it back up in the air? I mean...
Well, I did. I probably shouldn't have, but I, you know... Yeah, in those days, you just kind of do what you had to do. Yeah.
That's a crazy story.
Yeah. But quitting smoking? Yeah, I used to smoke, you know, the afraid dog thing, you know, with a coffee and a cigarette and flying along. And yeah, I was flying along, smoking, you know, fat, dumb, and happy, and I dropped my cigarette. It dropped in front of me and rolled forward and went down the slot into the belly of the airplane, lit. So, I don't know if you know it, but there's an awful lot of grease and oil and junk and everything in the belly of those airplanes, and so I was pretty nervous about that. So I got on the ground, I forget where and how fast, but that was the last time I smoked in an airplane.
I was going to say, after you kissed the ground,
Yeah.
you solemnly promised to
totally
put that pack away for good.
while I was flying. I smoked quite a while afterwards, but not in the airplane. But yeah.
Yeah. Oh boy. Yeah. The
So-
old guardian angel has worked long, hard hours for you.
Absolutely, yeah. There's more, but you know, we don't want to be here all day.
Right?
Flying into Houghton, Hancock, Michigan, in the winter, and those people really know how to move snow, and they get a lot of snow. And I think their average is over 200 inches a year. Anyway, so you can imagine the snowbanks on the side of the runway. It looks like you're landing in a tunnel. They're 8-10 feet high snowbanks, and they have to put flags out to show you where the taxiway is, so you can turn in the tunnel for the taxiway. And so that's the kind of flying that happened a lot there. I took her father flying with me on a trip one time, and my wife's dad, and it was we'd bulked out freight wise, so we had to go in the door and climb up over the top of the freight, down the cabin, and then head first into the cockpit, you know, to get in. Now we did have a quick release window on one side, but he never rode with me again after that.
Imagine that.
Another quick story, in the winter, I was flying out of a little place called White Cloud, Michigan. In fact, it was the same night I had her father with me, and it snowed like crazy while I was waiting for freight, and so there was like 6-8 inches of snow on the runway, and the city wasn't about to plow it then. They were busy with roads and stuff, so I called dispatch and said, I can't get out of here, you know. The runway's got 6-8 inches of snow on it. And the dispatcher, his name was Earl, said, well, just taxi up and down it several times until you get it packed down, and then you'll be okay.
And he was serious.
And he was serious. And I did. And we took off.
It was okay.
It was okay.
He knew what he was talking about.
Yeah.
And so now I know why your dad chose not to fly with him again.
Yeah, I think I would have checked.
And then my most infamous story, which came to mind, is simply I closed down Dayton International Airport one night. And
How'd you do that?
well, it was pretty easy. I was there waiting for freight, and it had rained and then changed to snow and slush, and it was a real messy night. And finally my freight came, and I got de-iced, and I had my freight loaded, got de-iced, and runway 4 left it was at the time. I taxied as fast as I could to get to the end of the runway, and got cleared for takeoff. And what I didn't know was they'd plowed the runway, but only right down the middle, you know. And and I had a really strong, gusty, quartering tailwind behind me. But I took off, shoved the throttles up, headed down the runway, got my left main caught in that big slushy snow pile, and off the runway I went. That was the only open runway of the evening. So I'm off the runway, and it rained so much before, I'm sunk in the mud, you know, and it was like airport. We had to go get Joe Petroni to get me out, you know. So, but in the meantime, they'd cleared a Learjet to land. I just left the runway, and I mean, it wasn't 20 seconds later, this Lear plows by me, you know. And the Lear goes, hey, Tower, did you know you got an airplane sitting on the side of the runway? And I hear this guy over the radio go, 03 Charlie, is that you? Yeah, yeah, it is. So, and then to my lucky night, the airport manager was touring the mayor of Dayton around to show him the wonderful snow removal operation. I just closed his airport. So I got to meet the mayor and the airport manager. So it was a good night. It was a good night.
That's good.
I looked at a log here a while ago, and I was looking at, you know, a lot of it's just, there's just nothing written in there because I didn't dare write it in, what happened. But the one night it's cold in my remarks. The next night it's very cold. And the third night it's extremely cold. So that's kind of sums up how that year went for me flying. So
Winter flying.
winter flying
For a freight dog.
for a freight dog. Yeah. Yeah. So
You survived it.
Those are
Yeah.
great stories, though.